The Story About Peter Wells by Merrick Badger, read by Tom Robinson. Hello, my name's Tom Robinson, and in 1976 I wrote a song called Sing If You're Glad to Be Gay, which indirectly gave rise to this book. It's written by Merrick Badger, and he explains the connection a little bit later on. In the course of publication, the suggestion came up of making an audiobook, and I volunteered to read it, which means that occasionally in the text you'll find me reading stuff written by Merrick about myself with which I may or may not agree. So think of me as Merrick Badger for the rest of this audiobook. Introduction. In 1978, the Tom Robinson Band followed up their top 5 hit 2468 Motorway with Glad to Be Gay. Barely 10 years after homosexuality was legalised, the straight world had never heard a gay song before, let alone one as assertive and angry. Over the years, Robinson changed the lyrics many times as new issues emerged and others were resolved. He was determined to keep the meaning the same. As a protest song, it was the protest that mattered more than the artistry. There have been more than a dozen different verses at different times, and following the creative evolution of it is fascinating. Rather like a poet restricting themselves to haiku, Robinson had to make new feelings fit a predetermined structure, and yet stay true to both the original intent and the topical subject. But over the years it's taken on a deeper significance. By charting gay issues for 30 years, from the mid-1970s, the different versions of the song trace the evolution of gay rights from the days of rampant persecution to an age of something akin to equality. As a generation comes of age who are incredulous that homosexuality was ever illegal, it's important to remember our social history. So I created a website, gladtobegay.net, that documents the various versions of the song and explains the references. This brought me to wonder about the man who Robinson had devoted a whole verse to. Have you heard the story about Peter Wells, who one day was arrested and dragged to the cells for being in love with a man of 18? The vicar found out they'd been having a scene. The magistrates sent him for trial by the Crown. He even appealed, but they still sent him down. He was only mistreated a couple of years, 'cause even in prison they look after the queers. The only online references to Wells were in vintage Robinson interviews and lyrics. I interviewed Tom for the website, and he was astonished that there was no documentation, explaining, "It was a cause célèbre in gay news and an absolute tragedy. It was literally as it's told in the song, that the local vicar grassed them up, an 18-year-old and a 26-year-old. He got 2.5 years, he appealed, and he still got sent down. Throughout his time in prison, he was beaten, abused, and put in isolation wings because of his sexuality." I resolved to uncover the story of Peter Wells. It quickly became clear that, contrary to Robinson's memory, the case hadn't attracted much publicity. It went almost unnoticed in the press. Even the gay press didn't report his trial or conviction, only commenting once he lost the appeal against his sentence. There was no great public outcry. As Gay News said, covering every legal injustice against gay people would take more print space than they had, and would have been monumentally depressing to boot. This sort of thing was happening all the time. The horrific, violent end to Wells's short life was something else entirely, though. Like the website, this booklet exists to help maintain a clear memory of our recent injustice against non-heterosexuals. I thought that would be the straightforward moral, but as I researched Peter Wells's life, I found that his story, like anyone's, was a lot more complex than it initially appeared. Peter Wells is no martyr to be idealised. He was clearly a confused, contradictory personality. Capable of great generosity, he was also abusive and cruel. He was socially outgoing, yet hid large parts of his life away. And, just as he was starting to find himself and live a more compassionate life, a throwback to his abused earlier ways led to his untimely death. But beyond the man himself, I found that Peter Wells's story illuminates not only our persecution of gay men, but other dark areas of our recent past too. Damaged youngsters were berated rather than counselled, and the Victorian brutalisation of children continued well into modern times. Peter Wells was a victim of it all. We mustn't forget those who suffered like Peter Wells, and equally, we must remind ourselves that just because today's society also discriminates against and dehumanises whole groups, it doesn't mean it's justified or tolerable. In 2013, it's easy to think that the rampant institutionalised bigotry of Peter Wells's time is something remote, and yet it's barely 10 years since gay men were given the same age of consent as straights. Indeed, there are still tens of thousands of men whose lives have been stymied by convictions for sex offences because they committed acts that are now their protected legal right. What's more, the Protection of Freedoms Act 2012 allows men convicted of consensual private sex with men over the age of 16 to have the records of their arrest and convictions erased. I cannot think of another law which, once repealed, gave retroactive pardon to its victims. We've come so far, so fast, that we're in danger of forgetting what was done. Going back to Peter Wells's time, the 1967 change in the law was more of a decriminalisation than legalisation of homosexuality. As Lord Reed said at the time, "There is a material difference between merely exempting certain conduct from criminal penalties and making it lawful in the full sense." 2 men over 21 could have sex if they were alone and in private. Everything else was still gross indecency. Men were being convicted of it by the thousand. Far from the new legislation heralding an age of tolerance, in the 5 years after 1967, convictions for gross indecency actually rose by 160%. Men were usually fined around £20, which is £200 to £300 today, and queer bashers who beat gay men up were fined about the same amount. So a public gay kiss or a tooth-cracking headbutt to a stranger's face were equal crimes in society's eyes. Worse than gross indecency were the penalties for sex with underage men, or the penalties for buggery, the anachronistic term for anal sex. Straight sex was legal with 16-year-olds, but gay men had to be 21. Thousands of men were convicted of consensual sex with men under 21, which was usually punished with imprisonment. Peter Wells was 26. His boyfriend was 18. This discrepancy of ages was enough to get him sentenced to 2.5 years in jail. There, his queer offences made him the target of beatings, rape, and other assaults from guards and inmates alike. Normalised, justified, excused and ignored at the time, to modern eyes, Peter Wells's case is a story of horrifying persecution and torture. And yet, despite living a short life defined by brutality that he not only received but on occasion administered, Peter Wells left a legacy of liberty for those who came after. Family background and early life. Peter Vernon Wells was born on the 29th of December 1947 in Bristol. As a baby, he was adopted by Harry and Mary Wells from Sanderstead, just south of Croydon in Surrey. In the 1960s, Croydon would become the next town to be subsumed into the London conurbation. Great swathes of the district were demolished and rebuilt in pebble-dashed concrete, and the town was subjected to the whitewater flows of a traffic system seemingly designed to terrify its users. This expanded Croydon threw tentacles out so that nowadays it almost blends into Sanderstead. The park on Sanderstead Road near Peter's first and last homes is called South Croydon Recreation Ground. Yet still, Sanderstead is where the capital's rushing intensity, with people packed together like nodules on a raspberry, breaks apart and calms itself into something much more genteel and sedate. Certainly in the 1940s, Sanderstead was a long, long way from the Croydon area's cosmopolitan bustle of today. It was its own distinct locale, and Sanderstead Road stood on an escarpment, the edge of a tranquil, wealthy village with a heralding view out over rural Surrey. The Welleses were wealthy medical professionals. Harry Vernon Wells was born in London in July 1900, and as a young man worked at Charing Cross Hospital and then in Birmingham, where he became a well-regarded surgeon. In the early 1930s he moved to Sanderstead and took a post at Purley Hospital. Turned down for military service during the Second World War, he was nonetheless vital in working in the South London hospital during the years of air raids. Mary Lancaster Wells, née Marsh, was born in 1903, also in London, where she too became a medical doctor. They married rather late in life, he aged 43, she 40, on the 12th of July 1944 at St Mary's Church in Sanderstead. They set up home together at Wilcot, a house on Sanderstead Road so large that it had a separate house, Wilcot Lodge, in its grounds. Its extensive sloping garden ran down to Purley Oaks Road, directly opposite the church where they'd married. The houses along the mile of Sanderstead Road were without numbers, just names for these vast edifices and their spacious gardens. They were so grand that in the early 1980s 5 of them, including Wilcot, were demolished and provided enough space to build 5 new detached houses with gardens, plus a whole new street, Montana Close, with an array of 3-storey buildings containing over 80 apartments. The Wellses lived at Wilcot with Mary's widowed mother, also called Mary. After 2.5 years of marriage, the couple adopted baby Peter, giving him the middle name Vernon, just like his father. Then they adopted a girl, Gillian, not long after. Whatever dreams they had of family life were cut sharply short in 1949, when on the 2nd of September, Harry died of a stroke, aged just 49. Peter was 18 months old. Mary hired a lot of help with domestic and parenting duties, including Margaret Matthews, a live-in nanny for the children. Things were to get worse for the family. In the late 1950s, Mary Wells developed breast cancer and succumbed to it in 1960 on the 12th of April, aged 56. Peter was 12 at the time. A little over a week before she died, Mary Wells made a will that put her children under the guardianship of the Sandover family, who had 3 children of their own. They had been close for some time, and Mary Wells had been godmother to Susan Sandover. Mary's will made minor bequests to loved ones and the Imperial Cancer Research Fund, and donated her eyes to Moorfields Eye Hospital. The bulk of her money was to be used to give her children the same living standard as those of the Sandovers. After that, her considerable estate was to be divided in 2 and held in trust for Peter and Gillian until they reached the age of 25. Tony Sandover was 6 years younger than Peter and consequently didn't spend a lot of time with him. He remembers Peter as a mixed-up guy, someone who clearly wanted to be someone that he wasn't, and that Peter and Gillian were not at all close. The Sandovers sent the Wells children to boarding school, but the precise details aren't clear. One record says that after Harry's death, he was with nannies and a succession of schools. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given the trauma and separation that had dogged his childhood, Peter was a boy with problem behaviour. It's not clear when this started, nor how serious it was, but it was certainly enough to have him attending a reform institution. Around the time he turned 14, or possibly earlier, he was a pupil at Starhurst School in Dorking. Today, Starhurst is a special day/residential school, providing for boys aged 11 to 16 years who have severe social, emotional and behavioural difficulties. It catered for the same demographic in the 1960s, though the vocabulary was then delinquent and borstal. This implies that Peter went there around the time of his mother's death, as he would have been too young to go much earlier. It's unclear if the school was residential at that time, as they don't have records dating back that far. Starhurst's current headmaster is the longest-serving of its staff, and he says that the school has trebled in size since the 1960s, but even now only has 20 boarders and 50 pupils. Back then, there would have been probably only 1 classroom, and he cannot imagine where boarding space would have been, so it feels it was probably a day school. However, it is about 20 miles from Sanderstead, which would have meant an enormous daily commute. If Peter wasn't resident at Starhurst, he certainly would be at his next institution. On the 27th of February 1962, 14-year-old Peter was in court, convicted of breaking and entering and of stealing. He was given a conditional discharge and 30 shillings costs, but his guardian Raymond Sandover decided a change needed to be made. It's easy to picture this boy given away at birth, his adoptive father dead before his memory begins, and so brought up by nannies, as an alienated and lost figure. The fact that his mother died slowly during so formative a time, taking his parents from him for the second time in 12 years, must have been devastating. Little wonder, then, that he lashed out at the world around him. These days, we would seek to support and comfort him, to give him the security and intimacy that his life had been lacking. Instead, the response of his guardian was, in keeping with the prevailing attitudes of the times, to make him move away from anything familiar once again. Only this time, it was to an isolated institution of damaged individuals that thrived on humiliation and violence. On the 3rd of May 1962, Peter was taken to the training ship Arethusa. Training ships were a Victorian institution for instilling strict discipline into destitute and wayward children. The fact that poverty was seen as something of a moral failing meant that the two groups could readily be banded together. Much of their work was made obsolete by expansion of the fostering system and the raising of the school-leaving age. A 1994 documentary in the BBC's series Forbidden Britain, Our Secret Past 1900 to 1960, with newsreel footage of the first Arethusa ship in 1931, explains that hard naval discipline and summary punishment for the smallest offence were thought to be an effective means of turning young rebels into tough seamen. Those summary punishments were often in the form of beatings with sticks on the buttocks in front of the rest of the assembled child inmates. One interviewee in the BBC film, George Kirkby, had been an inmate on the training ship Cornwall on the Thames in the 1930s, and he described having his head put between the boatswain's legs while the captain caned his buttocks in front of the assembled inmates. It is said that the Arethusa was unusual in that, unlike most other training ships, its canings were inflicted on the boys' bare buttocks. It's not hard to see how this environment could lead to horrendous abuse. It was arguably designed for it. Shaftesbury Holmes and Arethusa's first training ship was HMS Chichester, but it was the name of the second training ship, the former HMS Arethusa, purchased in 1874, which was adopted for subsequent Shaftesbury Holmes ships. The Arethusa, which had been the last Royal Navy warship to go into action under sail alone, remained in service as a training ship until 1932. Its replacement was another sailing vessel, the merchantman Peking, built in Germany. In 1933, she became the second Arethusa training ship at a new base, which had been established at Lower Upnor on the River Medway in northeast Kent, 40 miles from Sanderstead. Peter was 14 when he joined the Arethusa. The experience was to prove formative, adding a brutalizing element to his psyche that would contribute to his early death. He stayed there for almost 2 years, leaving in 1964 on the 19th of March, aged 16. The transition of Arethusa training ships from places of nightmarish ill treatment to today's places of recreation and adventure has been slow and somehow seamless. In 1975, that second Arethusa, the one aboard which Peter had been an inmate, had become uneconomical to maintain, and so she was sold, to be replaced by a new offshore cruising ketch. That new boat was so successful that it was soon replaced with a purpose-built vessel. In 1982, this fourth Arethusa came into service, offering sea-going holidays and adventures for youngsters from disadvantaged backgrounds. The Arethusa Venture Centre and climbing wall, built on the Arethusa shore base, are at Lower Upnor to this day. In 1964, in keeping with the maritime career path that his time aboard the Arethusa had led him towards, and perhaps for want of any real vocational calling, Peter transferred to do a course at a radio marine school, RMS Ray Castle, near Ambleside in Cumbria. This was definitely not a punitive place for the aberrant. Cadets were to become officers in the merchant navy, responsible for the safety of their own and other ships. It trained bright boys who, at Peter's age, would be expected to have GCE O-levels. In 1963, it cost £400 per term, a figure well in excess of £6,000 in today's money. That he should move to such an elite establishment indicates that Raymond Sandover's sending him to the Arethusa was not born out of any cruelty. More likely he was simply doing what seemed best by the standards and mores of the day. However, he may also have wanted to keep this volatile delinquent out of the Sandover family home. When he was about 20, Peter spent a year in Australia and had some administrative involvement with the Australian Nazi Party. Alarming as this sounds, Tony doesn't remember Peter having any political views, and nobody else I've spoken to can make this fit with their knowledge and understanding of him. His later partner, James, confirms that it happened, but rather than being ideological, it was more of a post-adolescent rebellion, a way to seem important. It has been suggested that perhaps there was some sexual reason to his involvement, but whatever, Peter swiftly withdrew his interest and never had any dealings with similar groups again. Back to Sanderstead. Peter returned to Sanderstead not long afterwards. Tony Sandover remembers that he worked at Stanley Gibbons' stamp dealers in London, and that stealing some rare misprinted World Cup stamps caused a huge row with his father, Raymond Sandover. Peter settled into a gregarious social life. He played rugby and was opening bowler for his local cricket team. He went to church at the next place that would define his life, up at the top of Sanderstead Road Hill. All Saints is a striking flint-walled Anglican church dating back 6 centuries and commanding sweeping views of the flat land below to the west and the south. In 1967, aged 19, Peter was in the Church Servers Guild and sang in the choir. He was later joined in both roles by someone who would become central to him for the rest of his life. James, not his real name, was 8 years younger than Peter. I traced him, and in the only interview he's ever given, he spoke candidly of their time together. I never knew anything of his life before I met him at the church. He always kept his background pretty close to his chest. He wouldn't say, remembers James. For most of the congregation, and especially the young, the church had more of a social focus than a religious one. In such a well-to-do area, it was de rigueur to go on Sundays. The youth, having little else to do, would use it as a springboard for get-togethers. There was this church group which was run by a guy called Mick the Vic, who was a curate at the time, James recalls. Many of us used to meet up on a Sunday night after services, often at the church hall around at the vicar's flat. We'd jam and listen to music. After he moved to another parish, we moved it round to my house. Quite often there'd be rooms and rooms full of people. In December 1972, Peter came into his inheritance. It's difficult to ascertain exactly how much it was, and in turn how much that's worth in today's money, but at his trial in 1974 the Daily Mail reported it as an estimated £100,000. This may be an exaggeration. Peter certainly liked to impress people about his wealth. For instance, his major interview for Gay News talks of him owning his house outright, whereas in fact it was rented from a private landlord. The Evening Standard's report from the court says that Peter had been described as being of independent means following a large inheritance, but his Gay News interview talks of his job as a personal assistant to the managing director of a plastics firm. That PA role is rather specific and frankly weird for him to have made up, so it seems that the independent wealth is less likely to be true. When his mother died in 1960, her estate was worth £38,879, 4 shillings and 9pence. In 1972 money, that would have been £67,900. That is the worth of the entire estate, of which the Sandovers would have spent a good deal on the children's education. Only the remainder would have been split between Peter and his sister. Whatever the precise figure, it is clear that Peter had some money to play with. A year later he moved into 14A Glossop Road, a 3-room ground-floor flat in an unassuming semi-detached house. Clearly the advent of riches didn't make Peter want to explore the world, but instead embed himself as closely as possible to the place where he'd grown up. Glossop Road is a modest cul-de-sac backing onto the car park of Sanderstead Station. It's the opposite side of the railway line from 58 Mayfield Road, where Peter's father, Harry Wells, had lived prior to his marriage, and several hundred metres round the corner from his childhood home, Wilcott, which he would have passed every Sunday on his way up to church. A neighbour from the time remembers Peter as a popular person who often had friends around, but also a highly stressed man. Like his father, Peter had a taste for expensive cars. He bought a Jaguar and a number plate for it with his initials, PVW9. Carl Rosner ran and still runs a garage opposite Sanderstead station, with a back entrance a few doors along from Peter's house on Glossop Road. The Jag was a metallic light blue S-type, and Carl says it was Peter's pride and joy. He kept it immaculate. Any little noise in it and he brought it in to be looked at by the mechanics at Rosner's. Carl remembers that Peter was in the garage most days, always buoyant and quite a character. That said, and in contrast to his neighbours' memories, the staff at Rosner's didn't really see him with people, especially during the day, and if anything he seemed a bit of a loner. They didn't know what he did for a living, or even if he had a job. Peter was a bit mysterious about his past, but Carl knew he'd been adopted by a local doctor. It was clear that Peter had quite a lot of money, but it seemed to come in periodic payments, as Peter would run up bills and then suddenly pay them off in full. For a man with money since December 1972, it is perhaps odd that he left it until the 1st of February 1974 to make his first will. What that document said is unknown. We only know about it from a reference in a later will. And then, in August 1973, 25-year-old Peter began a sexual relationship with 17-year-old James. Though they were both involved with the church, it didn't overwhelm them with puritanical values, James recalls. I wouldn't say Christianity was an important part of Peter's life. His sexuality was an important part of his life. Peter, for all his sociability, had an aggressive and tortured side. He was two sides of a coin. On the one hand, he could be very nice, very pleasant, very endearing to people, kind-hearted, and on the other, he could be a sadistic bastard. He was into sadomasochism, basically, James says. He wasn't obviously gay. He used to invite me round for a coffee or a chat or whatever, and then, one day, he said, "You'll do what you're told," and it got into a rather one-sided relationship. Though Peter was generally reluctant to talk about his past, he did definitively tell James that his BDSM tendencies came from his experiences aboard the Arethusa. He said he got into it there and he could only get that sort of buzz from doing that sort of thing, James says. Peter was always very flash with his cash. He dressed very smartly, pinstripe suits, collar and tie, very clean-shaven, gave the impression he was affluent and middle class. We used to have dinner at the Rolls-Royce and Bentley Club in Woldingham. It was very very specialised and elite. The majority of people there had Rolls-Royces or Bentleys, which speaks for itself. He liked to go to casinos and lose a few quid, such as the Connoisseur Club at the bottom of Tottenham Court Road. Very upmarket, they parked your car for you. There were a number of posh places he'd go for dinner or gambling, and he lost quite a lot of money. They spent a lot of time together, and Peter later told Gay News, "You don't have a 9-month relationship with a guy without being fond of him. In fact, I loved the guy." The two men had been seeing each other for about 9 months when, in spring 1974, James's mother's suspicions about them grew strong. A much more committed Christian than her son, she turned to the rector of the parish, Canon Derek Landreth. He called the two men in after church one Sunday, and, aware not only of the social stigma, but the criminality of their relationship, they denied everything. But James's mother persisted. She was very anti-gay. She thought she was doing the right thing, so-called protecting me. In one sense I understand it, and in another I don't. My mum was of the philosophy that telling the truth was all important, even if it hurts someone. When it came out there was something going on, the snowball went rolling. I was pushed into a corner. 2 days later, James went back to the rector and told him the truth. Though it was after midnight, the rector sought advice from a particular parishioner. The rector called a policeman who was a member of the congregation and asked him what he should do, Peter later told Time Out. Of course, the policeman told him to turn us in. If you ask a fisherman whether to eat fish or meat, he'll tell you fish. If you ask a policeman about a so-called crime, he'll tell you to go to the police. The rector took James to a police station, where he was questioned, medically examined, and locked up for several hours. Being treated as a criminal was an ordeal unlike anything he'd experienced before, and this young man, pressured from all sides, frightened and isolated, told the police everything. The next day, a friend of both men contacted Peter and explained the situation. Peter immediately rang his solicitor and then the police, arranging to go in that evening at 8:30. But at 7:30 the police arrived at Peter's house, threatening to smash their way in. Peter ran out of the back and clambered up the 8-foot wall into the station car park to get away. He met up with his solicitor and they went to the tiny local police station at Kenley. On arrival, the officers put Peter in a cell and refused entry to his solicitor. In the small hours, officers came and interrogated him. After a further 3 sessions during the night, at 5:30 a.m, he was transferred to Croydon Police Station. He was put in front of magistrates later in the day, who remanded him in Brixton Prison. The following week, bail was refused again by Croydon magistrates, so Peter took the matter before a judge in Chambers, who granted bail on £2,500 sureties, with the condition that he was not to contact James. That would be difficult anyway, as James had been spirited away from the storm of scandal to a hostel in Liverpool. There was a friend of his who was into the same sadomasochistic stuff who thought I should be out the way, so I stayed in a hostel in Hope Street. I spent most of my time there playing the grand piano. I was there for a few weeks. I just needed to get away from it and it got arranged. But Peter spent £1,000 hiring a private detective who successfully found James. I had to see him because I had no real idea about what was happening, Peter later explained to Time Out. The two met up. Did James think that was understandable, or did it feel like he was being stalked? A bit of each. Again, it was control, wasn't it? Their meeting did not stay secret, and in May 1974, Peter was remanded back into Brixton Prison with no hope of bail. His life shattered, he attempted suicide by slashing his wrists, and then again by self-strangulation. Outside, the police were piling resources into their investigation. The police then interviewed all my friends and my parents' friends, 78 people altogether. You can imagine what that was like in a place like Sanderstead. They also ransacked my house, Peter told Time Out. Searching the Glossop Road flat, detectives found whips and canes. They located another 18-year-old who Peter had paid £100 to for a one-night stand. Charged with 2 counts of buggery, he appeared at the Old Bailey on the 9th of August, 1974. Peter's wealth allowed him to engage the services of a prominent barrister, Robin Simpson QC, who spoke of the deep affection between James and Peter and explained that everything they had done had been consensual. For the prosecution, Nicholas Purnell told the court, "One of Wells's aberrations was that he dressed young men up as schoolboys, then flagellation and indecency took place. Later, detectives found a tape recording of a young man screaming and sounds of beating." In the internet age, we're all familiar with kinky sex. In antediluvian 1974, this was still profoundly shocking stuff to hear. The details of restraints and beatings were not relevant. The charge was one of buggery, not of assault or false imprisonment. The fact that the prosecution didn't allege those other crimes indicates that they knew it was consensual. But they also knew that these details would cast Wells in the role of dangerous deviant and ensure a heavy sentence. The mainstream view was that any perversion equalled all perversion. Not only was homosexuality or BDSM equivalent to sexual violence or paedophilia, but evidence that someone was into one of those things meant that they were likely to be into all of them. Purnell conceded that James had been consenting in the relationship for the first 4 or 5 months, but alleged that he'd only continued it out of fear. The laws around homosexuality were draconian. Buggery had carried a maximum sentence of life imprisonment before the 1967 Act amended it. In 1974, buggery with a man aged between 16 and 21 carried a maximum sentence of 10 years if there was no consent, and 5 years if there was. However, in cases of buggery and gross indecency, admitting consent made you into an offender. There was a strong incentive to say you were not partners. "I testified in court against him," James said. "He didn't hold that against me because he knew I hadn't instigated it, and even today I don't hold anything against him. There were times when I did, but times when I didn't. It's a hard to explain relationship." The fact that James was underage for homosexuality added an insurmountable slant to the trial, and despite being an adult in almost every other sense, for this charge he was regarded as having some kind of half-formed, gullible personality. The judge accepted James's taste for flagellation and sadomasochistic acts, but he told Peter they could only have developed as a result of his association with you. In that one comment, we see the conflation of the BDSM practices with the buggery for which he is actually charged. That discovering a taste for acts is indistinguishable from being forced or indoctrinated into them, and the belief that young men are corrupted into homosexuality by older, predatory men. By entering a plea of guilty, Peter would garner a lighter sentence and a shorter trial, but it also meant there was no opportunity to cross-examine witnesses, and thereby have James say anything that would cast their relationship in a more balanced light. It was a deliberate strategic choice on Peter's part. "He didn't want me in the dock," James emphasises. In ensuring that James did not admit to consensuality and thereby incriminate himself, Peter took on the mantle of the stereotypical predator that the press and judiciary loved to depict. With an insight into the core of Peter's motivation and experience, James himself says the relationship was not clear-cut either way. He wasn't all bad, not in any sense. He could be very kind, very helpful. He just had specific weaknesses in his character, which I don't blame him for entirely. Abuse can mould the way you think and the way you are. It made it very conflicting to be in a relationship with him because you never knew if you were going to face Peter Wells 1, lovely and terrific, or Peter Wells 2, I'm an evil bastard and I'm going to beat you to fuck. You didn't know what you were going to walk into. So, yes, there was an element of fear for a while, but you've got to look deeper than that. It seems that, abused as a youth, Peter asserted the control that had been taken from him by replaying over and over scenes like those he himself had suffered. Several years later, when Peter challenged the UK government's treatment of him at the European Court of Human Rights, James gave a signed statement saying, "Throughout my relationship with Peter Wells and prior to his arrest, nothing took place between us without my consent. It has been suggested that at some stage in the history of the matter I was virtually made a prisoner of by Mr. Wells and was beaten and forced to take part in homosexual acts. I do not regard this as a true version of what occurred." Peter was remanded in Wandsworth Prison for reports to be compiled before sentencing. He had a low-key conciliatory visit from someone very important to him. James says, "I went to see him in Wandsworth Prison at his request. He'd been in a short while, 3 months or so. He was reserved, subdued, very, very quiet. It wasn't a case of apportioning blame. I didn't go with any preconceived ideas of what to say to him. I just felt this needed sorting. Peter wasn't a person you could just dislike." Almost a month after his conviction, on the 5th of September 1974, Peter returned to the Old Bailey, where Judge Abdallah QC sentenced him to 2.5 years for his relationship with James and 6 months for the one-night stand to run concurrently. It's worth noting that the maximum sentence for sex with a girl aged between 13 and 16 was 2 years. "Debauched life of ex-choir boy," drooled the Evening Standard headline on his conviction. The Daily Mail harmonised with a piece about his sentence. "Double life of the former choir boy. Former choir boy Peter Wells, 26, was a regular among the congregation at a Surrey church, but after the hymns and prayers, he returned to his bizarre double life of sadism and debauchery." Into prison. It's clear that Peter Wells was at times an aggressive, controlling man, and we must not seek to condone or ignore that. However, it is also clear that his kinky tendencies were used in court to imply a far worse standard of behaviour. More to the point, even if everything the prosecution said was true, if he had been straight, there is no way he would have got anywhere near the inside of a cell, let alone suffered the torture that awaited him during his 2 years of incarceration. But in 1974, Wells's ilk were seen as vicious, corrupt monsters preying on children. He was repeatedly assaulted in prison, even before he'd been convicted, by guards and inmates alike. After sentencing, he was incarcerated as prisoner number 132737 at Wormwood Scrubs. 3 weeks later, he launched an appeal against his sentence, but it would be 6 months before that came to court. Back in small-minded Sanderstead, James was enduring his own purgatory. It was a big deal at the church. Sanderstead was a small conservative community. I'd never seen a black person till I was 23 and I came up to London. I was more or less excommunicated effectively. I was considered to be in the wrong as well. I wasn't seen as the victim. I might as well have been doing the prison sentence. In the meantime, the newspaper reports of an ex-choir boy having sex with 2 18-year-olds had been garbled by the prison rumour mill. His fellow inmates believed he'd been convicted of sex with 2 8-year-old choir boys. At the end of 1974, Peter had spent 8 months in jail and been assaulted no fewer than 9 times. His face and chest were scarred, his nose bent, and he still refused to complain about his treatment. "You just don't tell tales," he explained to Gay News after his release. "You don't grass in prison. It could get worse." At the end of his time at Wormwood Scrubs, the governor compiled a report on his assaults. They included 1. On remand, he was assaulted by 2 prison officers because of the nature of his offence. He received some bruising. 2. After conviction, but before his sentence, he was assaulted by other prisoners while having a bath in the reception area. He received blows to the nose and was admitted to the prison hospital. 3. He was attacked on arrival at the Scrubs after sentence and was kicked on the back of the head. 4. Shortly after this, he was put on a report for fighting with another prisoner. This started because of the nature of his offence. 5. A few days later, he was attacked again by inmates when returning from the exercise yard. 6. In October, he was kicked in the chin and foot, and although he received an injury to his big toe, did not report the incident. He waited 3 weeks before getting medical attention. 7. In November, Peter had boiling water thrown over him while collecting his meal at the hot plate. He lost consciousness on the way to hospital. 8. The same month, Peter was pushed into his cell, his gear disarranged and his bedding soaked by other prisoners. 9. The final assault came in December, when he was pushed around by 3 other prisoners on a landing. He was also held down by a group of prisoners so he could be raped by one of their number. He contracted syphilis as a result. Despite all this, he did not invoke Rule 43, which would have meant solitary confinement for his own personal safety. Not only because of not wanting to be labelled a grass, but also because, despite the attacks, he enjoyed the company of other prisoners. For the first time in his life, he was openly gay, and he had frequent sex with the other inmates, both the gay and those who turned gay for the duration of their sentence. Once the authorities realised the extent of the abuse Peter was receiving, and keen to prevent him from having sex with inmates, in January 1975 they moved him to solitary confinement at Lewes Prison. His mental state finally collapsed. A doctor at London's Maudsley Hospital described his condition. "When I saw him, Mr. Wells was obviously very anxious and depressed. He had a coarse tremor of his hands, which he could only control by clenching his fists in his pockets. He sat throughout the interview hunched up with downcast eyes, avoiding my gaze. He sweated profusely. He appeared intensely fearful, glancing at the door apprehensively before answering any questions. He told me that he was sleeping badly and was weeping every night. He had lost 4 stones in weight, partly because he had lost his appetite, and partly because he was fearful of eating with the other men at the canteen. The doctor concluded that Peter would only get better after release, and made clear that help was waiting for him at the hospital. On the 2nd of May 1975, the Court of Appeal considered Peter's appeal against his sentence. Curiously, the rector who triggered the case, Canon Derek Landreth, had submitted a letter supporting the appeal, as had the Bishop of Gloucester. James confirms that this was controversial to the congregation, noting, "As far as I'm aware, he didn't last too much longer after that." Of the 3 judges sitting in court that Friday, Lord Chief Justice Widgery, the highest-paid legal officer in the country, presided. Yet again, Peter fell victim to the homophobic bigotry of the age. In his summing up, Widgery noted the great many reports indicating Peter's need for early release and the undue harshness of his sentence, and he said, "There is a great deal of evidence that he is unlikely to get very much better unless and until he is treated out of prison. He has become a psychiatric patient now, urgently in need of treatment." However, he concluded, "He maintains quite stoutly that he does not intend to give up these homosexual practices, and the fact that Mr. Wells is oriented towards the late teenagers and young men of the next generation does make him a person who, in our view, is a danger to the public. We are very conscious of the fact that this is not a case in which the appellant hopes to change his ways. The appeal is therefore dismissed." No distinction was made between homosexuality and illegal homosexuality. Peter had not said he would continue to see underage men, merely that he was gay. But to Widgery, as to society at large, all homosexuals were predatory paedophiles, and therefore Peter should stay locked up even as his psyche crumbled. The court specifically asserted that he was not a paedophile, but a 26-year-old man who fancied men in their late teens and early 20s, saying, "He does not seem to have had any particular taste for young boys, which is no doubt an advantage, both from the court's point of view and his own when it comes to sentence." Were he the same person but heterosexual, it would be fine. The fact that he was a homosexual made him a threat that we needed protection from. Peter shouted as he was led from the court, "Haven't you had enough vengeance? If I'd lied and said I'd decided not to be a homosexual, I suppose it would have been all right. They just couldn't stand my saying that I was happy to be gay," he later told Time Out. The Croydon Advertiser reported it a week later, on the 9th of May. A month after that, Gay News did a small news item and an editorial. This is the first time Peter's story appeared in the gay press. Despite Tom Robinson's memory saying otherwise, there was no great cause célèbre. This was unremarkable treatment happening to thousands of men across the country. By now, Peter was back in Wandsworth Prison, as Lewes Prison Hospital couldn't deal with him. Sat in solitary confinement, the conditions eroded him. He later told Time Out of the everyday horrors. "They brought in a young junkie. I could hear them fighting with him. Even my cell was shaking with the noise. Eventually they shot him full of Largactil. He was dead in the morning. The coroner's verdict was that he died of dehydration. People have no idea what sort of things go on inside prison. And that bloke was just awaiting trial. He hadn't even been convicted." With only half an hour's walk round the yard every day, he endured what he called a living death by clinging to tiny threads of sanity. At the end of the summer, he felt confident enough to start an English A-level. The tutor came in once a week, and as the only person he spoke to who wasn't a guard, she was his lifeline. At the same time, Peter also submitted a case to the European Court of Human Rights, not just for himself, but for all gay men. For reasons that aren't entirely clear, he did so anonymously, and the case is known as X versus United Kingdom. James explains that Peter wanted to protect his privacy and not put the details in the public domain. But, with his case already reported, it seems a slightly contradictory position to take. In his submission, Peter contended that his arrest and imprisonment were a violation of Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, which guarantees the right to respect for private life, and that homosexual relations between consenting adults should not be criminal offences. He claimed that the denial of his freedom to have sex whilst in prison contravened Article 10, that protects freedom of expression. And, perhaps most significantly, he also asserted that the different ages of consent for straight and gay sex were a violation of Article 14, which prohibits discrimination. Taking a case to the European Court was a long, drawn-out and expensive process. It wasn't until the Human Rights Act of 1998 came into force in the UK that human rights actually became enforceable for people who couldn't afford hefty legal bills or years of tenacious wrangling. The repeal of the Act, currently craved by the Tory press, will not remove our human rights. Only withdrawal from the Council of Europe can do that. It would just return us to the state we were in during Peter Wells's time, where rights were only effective for the rich. That Peter made this broader stand, trying to change the law for all, marked the germination of a new political mindset that would grow after his release from prison. On the 25th of January 1976, he made a new will. As with the one from 1974, we don't know what it said, only that it existed. Release. Peter was released from prison sometime around late February 1976. In early April, Time Out published a sympathetic interview piece, and then Gay News followed on the 20th of May with Peter's only substantial press article. It was this that the young Tom Robinson saw, just as the song Glad to be Gay was beginning to coagulate in his mind. For some reason that we can only speculate on, in this small flurry of press interest, Peter never mentioned his case at the European Court of Human Rights attempting to equalise the age of consent. Presumably it was motivated by the same desire for privacy that had led him to submit the case anonymously. Having had his solicitor arrange to continue paying rent throughout his period of imprisonment, he returned to 14A Glossop Road. A couple named Jerry and Margaret Boonus are on the electoral roll in his flat during his period of incarceration, and they would later be beneficiaries of his will. It is not clear who they were. He resumed some old acquaintances. There have been two kinds of reactions from people. For instance, the local cricket team have told me it would be better if I didn't come around. They say that some of the members have got young sons, he told Time Out, but last Christmas I got 59 Christmas cards, and one had 27 signatures on it. And the people I knew in pubs and places I went to in the middle of London don't mind at all. There was one person he was particularly keen to meet again. His Gay News interview has a description of his feelings for James that bears the hallmarks of somebody who's been traumatised. At times I have feelings of hate against him, other times feelings of love, and yet other times when there are no feelings. But basically, I love the guy. I'm not blaming him for what's happened. I blame society and old-fashioned, out-of-date laws and prejudices. As James had made clear, the church shunned gay men, but there was no love lost there for Peter. Whatever Christian belief he had evaporated while he was in prison, and, despite Canon Landreth's support for his court appeal, Peter was especially scathing about the rector. He is an old man with no comprehension of modern life, completely out of touch. He lives in a little world of his own, and that man could have solved it all by having a friendly chat with everyone concerned. That would have been the Christian thing to do, he told Gay News. He expanded in Time Out. It all seemed so pointless. The rector could have sorted the whole thing out just by getting us together and talking about it, instead of going to the police. I still can't understand it. I have never forced anyone to have a relationship with me. All of my relationships with men or women have been one-to-one. If I'd really done anything to be ashamed of, anything violent or brutal, then I would never have had the courage to come back to Sanderstead. I would have gone off and hidden somewhere in the West Country. Whilst that version of events is clearly not the whole story, it's interesting to note that James was far from bitter. He and Peter not only resumed contact, they rekindled their sexual relationship too. I saw him when he came out because I felt he needed somebody in his life who wasn't just kicking him, says James. He did try to blame me initially, but I had to make him see it was a snowball rolling, not me. It wasn't that I had turned on him. I didn't let anybody know that I used to see him. We were seeing each other sexually, but it wasn't one-sided anymore. It was me turning the tables, not to get my own back, but making the relationship fair. Before, it had been about his control and his needs, but now it was about playing it fair, not about my needs, but about equality. I saw him a couple of times a week for a long, long time. This equalisation permeated all aspects of their relationship. The sexual practices continued as before, but with more give and take, James remembers. He used to like dishing it out, but I turned the tables on him receiving it, and then he realised he liked receiving it too. The coverage in Gay News brought in responses from readers. One was from somebody who'd served 7.5 years. The vicious and heartless sentences given in such cases by our judges is made worse because our judiciary know of the physical sufferings to which they are sentencing such prisoners, as well as the length of the sentence as such. The animal brutality of many prison officers towards sexual offenders can only leave a bad taste in the mouth. And even when actual physical violence is lacking from these quarters, those who staff our prisons are quite capable, in 1,000 different ways, of inflicting various punishments harmful to the mental well-being of such prisoners. There is no doubt that the Home Office itself is concerned about the violence against the person of the sexual offender, hence the setting up in recent years of Rule 43 segregated wings and units. But even these are no more than mere scratches upon the surface of the problem. As for the corrupt, twisted minds of those inmates who inflict the types of injuries done to Peter Wells, little can be said that has not already been said in certain quarters. Nevertheless, and having said all that, I personally maintain that the most despicable facet of the whole situation is the almost indifferent attitude displayed by the gay fraternity as a whole. Over-concerned with all the enjoyments of the scene, there must be many thousands of gays in Britain alone who never raise a single word of protest to the Home Office about the vicious and inhuman treatment of sexual offenders in our prisons. This ridiculous complacency arises, no doubt, from the belief that, because of their own mature relationships, they are not themselves likely to fall into a similar situation. That is really a laugh. I can, from experience, assure such persons that our prisons are full of such gays who thought that it could never happen to them. But the fact is, in so many cases it did, and it could be your turn next. One never knows. It is precisely the kind of rage that fueled the writing of Glad to be Gay. The song did not start out as an assertive anthem to throw into the straight world of the top 20. It was written to be performed at Gay Pride 1976 as a scouringly sarcastic assault on the gay community's complacency in the face of their persecution. Given the timing of the letter and the personal focus Tom Robinson had on Gay News, it seems likely that the letter was a direct influence on the song. That Peter had done the media work, especially the piece with Gay News, is a further indication of his rising politicisation. He'd been taken to the Campaign for Homosexual Equality conference in Southampton a month after his release. He spoke of his experience and received an ovation. He joined the Croydon branch of CHE. Jim Sewell was a member too, and he remembers Peter as a particularly sociable man, the life and soul of the party. He was also unashamedly out about his sexuality beyond the confines of gay groups. Jim recalls that on one occasion Peter attended a rugby club dinner, and whilst all the other guests were accompanied by a wife or girlfriend, Peter was there with a notably camp little boyfriend. It's important not to overstate Peter's political affiliations, though. At CHE he wasn't an activist, but largely devoted his time to the social activities, especially the tennis group. That said, he did join the local Liberal Party and get a job with an altruistic basis. James saw the difference that imprisonment and injustice had wrought. Definitely, I think he learned a different viewpoint because of it. He had been an out-and-out conservative, and if anybody changed his viewpoint, it was me. His liberalism came about through many conversations with me over a long time. He could see that conservatism was working against him. He'd be concerned with any issue of unfairness or injustice. He worked for the London Ambulance Service, driving and as a general ambulance worker. I'd said, if you're concerned about other people, why don't you do a job that shows you care about people? I didn't force him to do it. I just said, why don't you do something that will benefit others? You say you've turned a corner and think about others first. Well, why not do something about it? I used to go to the gay pride rallies, and Peter did as well. It wasn't just about the gay thing. It was about humanitarian issues, really. He was into the Myra Hindley release campaign. We had dinner with Lord Longford. He was into CND, Greenpeace, that sort of thing. I got him involved in all that. I said, let's not talk, let's do. It made the difference to our relationship as well after he came out of prison. Even though it was a secret relationship until he died, it worked. It worked. And so he resumed his life. He still loved the gambling and the cars and the dinners at swanky clubs. One friend he made after his release recalls, he introduced me to the London casino for no apparent reason other than to show off. I was amazed at the amount of money he could lose in one evening, but tried to warn him that he could only harm himself by divulging such information to the young men who were his preference. I may have been wrong, but his occasional visits to our house and inclination to sit in the garden and fall asleep may have been a wish to escape from whatever the situation was, and he simply didn't know how to. He seemed to be slightly withdrawn. Perhaps the gambling helped him to contact other people and not to feel lonely, which he must have been. He certainly liked the idea of being a hell of a fellow, but I don't think he knew anyone for long, which possibly indicates a lack of character. This perspective is disproven, at least in part, by the fact that Peter had known James so well for so long, and that their relationship had matured considerably. But it is also quite easy to sense something adrift. A man who had never quite found himself. On the 3rd of January 1978, he took a piece of headed notepaper and typed out his will. He concludes with an apology. I am sorry that because of heavy gambling losses there's not more cash to be distributed to my beneficiaries. This is rather self-effacing, though. The hiring of top legal representation for his prosecution, of using them to fight numerous elements of the case to the last step, will have cost a huge amount of money. Likewise, taking his case to the European Court of Human Rights will not have come cheaply. In that will, early in 1978, he lists New Zealander Terence Fisher, currently residing at this address, as a beneficiary. And indeed, in the 1979 electoral roll, Terence Fisher is listed as living with Peter at 14A Glossop Road. Peter's mechanic, Carl Rosner, remembers that, as well as running his Jaguar S-Type with its PVW9 plate, some time after his release from prison, he got a Mini with the plate PVW2. He ran both cars simultaneously, and thinks that the Mini was for use by a friend. James remembers using the car, though it was based at Glossop Road. Could it have been for Fisher? Incidentally, Carl is not sure how legitimate the Mini's personalised number plate was, and suspects Peter simply had the plate made up and put on the car. Even if that wasn't the case, the fact that it can readily be believed suggests that Peter's flair for ostentation and minor flouting of the law may well have been constants throughout his life. James is certain that Peter lived alone, though. It was a small flat. You'd notice if there was someone else's things around. He definitely didn't live in Peter's flat. I know that for sure. I used to see Peter a couple of times a week, and sometimes I'd turn up when he didn't expect me to, and I don't believe for 1 minute there was anyone else living there. James's observations are certainly convincing, yet we know that Fisher was officially listed as living at the address, though not named on the tenancy, for over a year before Peter's death, that he was one of the 4 beneficiaries of Peter's will, and is almost certainly the person who found Peter's body. Quite what this means is unclear. All my efforts to trace further information on Terence Fisher have come to nothing, and, again, this is an aspect of Peter's story that we can only speculate upon. On the 5th of May 1978, Peter and his lawyer were in Strasbourg for the European Court of Human Rights oral hearing on the merits of his case. The UK government defended the law as it stood, and did so using a blatant contradiction. When considering Peter's challenge to his convictions, the government conceded that there had been a radical change in public values regarding the acceptability of homosexuality since 1974, and therefore he should be judged by the standards of that time, not of the more liberal 1978. And yet, in responding to Peter's challenge to the law itself not being in keeping with modern morals, the government claimed there had been no significant change in attitude since the Act was passed in 1967. The government contended that discrepancy between the ages of consent, heterosexual sex being allowed at 16 and gay sex forbidden until 21, was valid. It was, they explained, important, quote, to prevent homosexual acts with adults having an unfortunate influence on the development of heterosexual tendencies in minors. A person is either a minor or they're not. We cannot say they're an adult at 16 unless they're gay. For some reason, women over the age of 16 didn't need protecting from predatory men, nor anyone over 16 protecting from predatory women. It was just gay men that were a problem because homosexuality is, quote, unfortunate. The UK government went further and contended that the discrepancy was in fact a protection of the human right to a private life, insofar as it protected men under 21 from undue advances from older men. 5 months later, the Court's Commission delivered their report. They ruled that in spite of James, now over 21, having signed testimony to the contrary, they believed there had been an element of force in Peter and James's sexual activity in 1974. Therefore, it was right to imprison Peter in order to safeguard the rights and freedoms of others. They found that the different age of consent in UK law did indeed amount to an interference with the right to a private life. It noted that the age of 21 had been in place for a considerable time, whilst society had evolved to a more tolerant and understanding perspective. It also noted that there's an inconsistency in being able to vote or fight in the military at 18, yet not be able to have gay sex until 21. However, because the UK government had recently reviewed the age of consent and decided to keep it at 21, that was fine. In other words, the EHCR refused to overturn national law even though it contravenes the human rights that it is the sole purpose of the EHCR to uphold. They decided, by 9 votes to 2 with 1 abstention, that the unequal age of consent was not a breach of human rights. Even more decisively, 11 votes with 1 abstention, they decided that the different treatment for male and female homosexuality did not amount to discrimination. With the absolute certainty of a unanimous vote, they agreed that Peter's imprisonment for consensual sex with a man of 18 was not a breach of his human rights. One judge was uneasy about how it all looked and added his notes, explaining that because men are only prevented from sex with young men rather than any sex with all men, then there cannot be any real hardship. We should pity the poverty of that judge's relationships if he genuinely felt that anyone of the gender he is attracted to is interchangeable with one another. The court's decision was confirmed by the ECHR Council of Ministers on the 12th of June 1979. It would be 22 years before a young man called Ewan Sutherland took the UK government back to the EHCR and won equality. Sutherland's case cited Wells's work. As with so many seemingly lost political campaigns, Peter's case had laid vital foundations for others to come along and succeed. But Peter would not live to see that day come. Death. On the 2nd of February 1979, 25-year-old William Purton Henderson came to stay at Peter's flat. It seems that they had known each other for some time. At around 6 p.m. on Wednesday the 7th of February, Peter Wells came home to 14A Glossop Road. Purton Henderson was waiting with a double-barrelled shotgun that Peter legally owned. Soon after Peter entered the house, he was shot twice in the chest at point-blank range. The shot went right through his chest, and he died across the entrance to the living room. Burton Henderson fled, dropping the gun in a passageway beside the house. A little before 8 p.m, a man described as Peter's Australian friend who shared his house, surely Terence Fisher, found the body. Police arrested Burton Henderson a little over a mile away at an address in the Waldrons, Croydon. On Friday the 9th of February, Burton Henderson made a 1-minute appearance at Croydon Magistrates Court, where he was charged with murder and remanded in custody. The inquest into Peter's death was opened on the same day, with Raymond Sandover giving evidence of identification. How poignant it must have been for him, the man who as a family friend assumed guardianship of the adopted, then orphaned 12-year-old Peter, to have to make such a testimony. James reflects, "I was meant to see him the night he was killed, but something else cropped up. I went down the next day and there was police there and I couldn't get in." Precisely what happened that night isn't clear, as we only have Burton Henderson's version of events. On the 30th of March, he returned to Croydon Magistrates Court, where he was committed for trial at the Old Bailey. The trial began in September 1979, where he pleaded not guilty to murder. He offered a plea of guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of provocation, but this was rejected by the court. He described staying in on the day of the killing, watching TV and answering the phone for Peter. He said he spoke twice to Peter on the phone that day. The first call was friendly, but in the second Wells changed completely. He was hostile and claimed I was just using him. He told me, "When I get back tonight, you will pay." Burton Henderson maintained that he had not had a homosexual relationship with Wells. However, police inquiries found that he was a, quote, compulsive homosexual who had had affairs with numerous men. He'd been married and, although separated, he returned to his wife immediately after killing Peter Wells. Burton Henderson had told police how he loaded the shotgun and waited for Wells in the back room with the lights off. In court, he elaborated. "All I intended was to frighten him, and I don't know why I loaded it. I didn't intend to use it. I took the gun down out of reflex and loaded it. I said to Peter, 'Let me go, let me get out,' but he was not prepared to let me go. I didn't make it plain the gun was loaded. I was not levelling it at him. I was holding the gun downwards. I raised it when he lunged towards me. I didn't want to fire it, but I did fire it. I don't remember the second shot." This may be entirely true. Then again, it is the most mitigating version of events that the evidence would allow. Coupled with this are great swabs of vagueness and failure to explain himself on key incriminating details. Unintentionally loading the gun, never pointing it at Peter, not knowing how the second shot happened. Clearly, dropping the gun outside the house was not the work of a calculating person who had a clean getaway planned, but the action of someone not thinking clearly. His choice of phrasing is curious. I said to Peter, "Let me go, let me get out," but he was not prepared to let me go. Burton Henderson had been on his own all day. He could have used the front door at any time. If, and that is an if this sense of being trapped is true, it's not physical restraint, it's something psychological. Without wanting to let my internal amateur psychologist run away with me, with these admittedly scant details, it's easy to speculate about a man who is proven to be in denial as he wrestles with his own homosexuality. He's at the home of somebody who is gay and uninhibited. Did Peter represent a part of himself that he couldn't face? Is the "let me go" more addressed to his own homosexual feelings? Did he feel as if killing Peter was killing those feelings? Can we read further significance into his return to a heterosexual partner? It could also be something very different. Peter was clearly a man who liked physical restraint, power games, and submission-domination roles. In Burton Henderson's trial, police described finding a whipping frame and a large number of whips in Peter's bathroom. There was also a punishment book cataloguing beatings that Wells gave and received. These were frequent and covered a period of 18 months. To modern ears, the punishment book is an alarming item, but in the 1970s, corporal punishment was commonplace. Every school would have a cane for errant pupils, and a punishment book that logged its use. We know that Peter, perhaps in emulation of his time on the Arethusa and in other institutions, perhaps working through the things done to him there, enjoyed school uniforms as part of his sexual beatings. The punishment book would be a prop entirely in keeping with this. It's also notable that the book shows Peter both giving and receiving beatings. This suggests that, as James says, Peter was no longer as domineering as he had been earlier in his life. As with Peter's trial in 1974, the fact of him having one deviant sexual preference blurred the lines and made it easy for the court to imagine that he had a taste for other, more sinister practices. Peter Wells, the court was told, had given Purton Henderson a beating on a previous occasion, some considerable time before the night of the killing. The newspaper reports don't differentiate between the different senses of the word. A beating may be a frightening, violent assault, but to some, and certainly to Peter Wells, it may be an intimate, consensual act. It's not clear if the court drew this distinction. It's also not clear if it would even be fair to draw that distinction. Perhaps Purton Henderson, described as unemployed and of no fixed abode, was in a position of need, and perhaps Peter Wells took advantage of that for his own domineering pleasure. Perhaps, even, he was not open about his gay tendencies, and Wells had threatened some sort of shaming or blackmail. These are just some of the possible explanations. However, it is significant that everyone I've spoken to from Sanderstead, who knew of the case at the time, heard that Peter had been killed by some sort of jealous or spurned lover, with a strong suggestion of jealousy over a shared partner. James is confident he understands what happened. I believe Peter tried the same scenario with Henderson that he tried on me. I'm pretty damn sure, just because I know Peter Wells. In reality, I probably knew him better than anybody in the true sense of knowing how his mind works. He probably pulled out a cane and said, "I'm going to beat you," only this time the bloke said no. We shall never know for certain which of these things, if any, is true. The court certainly didn't think Purton Henderson's version of events was entirely truthful. Mr. Justice Griffiths told him, "The jury quite rightly rejected the defence of provocation. I think you deliberately waited there and killed the man as he came in." The jury acquitted him of murder, but convicted him of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. The distinction between reasons for the lesser charge of manslaughter, rejecting provocation but affirming diminished responsibility, is crucial. Provocation means Peter drove him to it. Diminished responsibility means Purton Henderson wasn't making sound judgments when he decided to do it. Rather than say it was Peter's fault, they make clear it was something wrong in Purton Henderson. Of course, very few people who kill are thinking clearly. This does not automatically mean that their crime is not murder. Mr. Justice Griffiths obviously thought the case was very close to the border with murder, telling Purton Henderson, "This is a very grave crime. This is a very bad case of manslaughter." At the Old Bailey on the 12th of September 1979, 5 years and 1 week after Peter Wells's sentencing there, William George Purton Henderson was convicted and sentenced to 7 years imprisonment. Or, to put it another way, about the same as 2 consensual relationships and 4 one-night stands with a man under 21. Peter's estate, drained by gambling, extravagant living and legal costs, was worth £2,307, somewhere around £10,000 in today's money. He left it to be divided amongst 4 sets of friends, though it appears that, for some reason, in the end it all went to the mysterious Boonus couple. It's not clear why there was a 3-month wait. Perhaps the inquest was adjourned for a long time, but Peter's funeral took place on Friday the 4th of May at Croydon Crematorium in Mitcham Road. His ashes were scattered just outside the crematorium building in the Garden of Remembrance at location 73-3. There is no marker to commemorate him. The key figure in his life wasn't in attendance on the day. James says, "I didn't go. I thought about it, wanted to, but I thought it wasn't a good idea because it would have made me look involved. It was self-protection. Doesn't mean to say I didn't want to go. I did." Even now, 30 years later, James speaks with great clarity and presence about Peter. You can feel that he's seeing Peter, feeling his character as he talks. He crops up in my life. Because of the conversations we had, I can still think, well, Peter would do this or say that. I've always felt that he's still around. Today, Peter would be in his mid-60s, able to have his convictions wiped and, thanks in no small part to his own legal efforts, able to enjoy an openly gay life in an era of equal marriage. All those who enjoy that world owe him a debt of gratitude. That was The Story About Peter Wells by Merrick Badger, read by Tom Robinson.